Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Pada. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk today, as you'll see, about the relationship between energy and money, which is absolutely fundamental. And yet it's something we forget, because economists typically regard energy as just another commodity which can be bought with money. And this is a major mistake. If there was no energy, we wouldn't have the energy to do anything, to supply anything. That energy may be solar energy, maybe human energy, it may be fossil fuels. But we need energy to be able to do absolutely anything. And so consequently, energy, it gives money its value, not the other way round. Gold, in fact, was an energy-based currency. The way it worked was that, supposing the price of slaves or horses or steam coal fell, in other words, the price of energy fell, it would become profitable to mine more gold, to set your slaves panning in the river, or whatever it was. And that gold would enable more trade to be financed, and of course that would push up the demand for energy, for slaves, for heavy horses, or for steam coal. So it was a nice, neat relationship, and it was one that worked satisfactorily for hundreds of years. And the only time it broke down was when people like the Spaniards stole gold from the Aztecs and the Incas, and that essentially destroyed the Spanish economy for about 200 years, because it meant that they didn't develop locally. They chose to use their gold to buy from the rest of Europe. Whether gold is still an energy-backed currency is a matter of opinion at the moment, but there's been an enormously stable relationship, as these figures show, between the number of barrels of oil that you can buy with an ounce of gold over the years. I mean, there's been times when the relationship has broken down severely, one way or the other, but that median figure is interesting. Look what it was on Thursday. That was the ratio after both the price of oil and other commodities fell. It's tagging along at about that level. But what about the supply of energy, and in particular the supply of oil? If we're going to be thinking about putting money into circulation, and there's this close relationship between energy and money, then we need to look at future energy supplies. And the level of output of oil has been on a plateau since about mid-2004. And the heading, "What about the Great Recession?" was, you see that although the demand for oil fell and the price fell very, very considerably, as you know, it fell from $145 a barrel to about $40 a barrel in a very short period, the output of oil only fell by less than 5%. The global output has been hovering within this 5% band. What we have to consider is what's going to happen next. Why is oil on a plateau? Why was no more produced, as the economists would have suggested, as the price went up? And of course the answer is that we've reached oil peak, that it's just not possible to produce oil any faster than is already being done. And studies by the International Energy Agency of the 600 biggest oil fields have shown that their output is declining on average by 6.7% a year. Now, what this means is that the oil companies are having to struggle like mad just to keep the current level of production up, and they're not going to do that for very long. That was why BP was drilling the deepest well ever drilled in the Gulf, where the problems developed. So if you put more money into circulation, when the amount of energy isn't increasing, then the price of that energy is going to go up to restore the relationship. Essentially then, this is the key to my argument, energy is the real money. Money is just in fact a proxy for energy rather than the other way around. So we all know that a lot of lending was going on, a lot of money was being put into circulation globally after 2004, and so, as one might expect, the price of energy went up in money terms. And this is what happened. So the top line there is the crude oil price, but it dragged up everything else with it, particularly food and other commodities. They all moved up too, largely because of scarcities appearing there too, but because so much energy is used in the production of things like aluminium, and food has been industrial food production has been described as a way of turning fossil energy into food energy. It's a very energy dependent system. So this is how Ireland's oil import bill grew. It grew from about 2% of our national income to over 7% of our national income. And I want you to look at the shape of that curve, and then look at the borrowing that went on. If I go back and then click on it again, so the bank's borrowing is represented by those blue bars. What we were doing was spending more and more, not just on oil, but on our other imports, particularly say raw materials, metals, and so on. And we were borrowing the money to do so from overseas. This is one of part of the origins of the crisis. Other countries were doing exactly the same thing. All the OECD countries, all the consumer countries were doing exactly the same. What was happening was that money was leaving countries like Ireland. You know, when we bought petrol, part of that, the purchase price, would go to Saudi Arabia. There was a wall of money hitting the commodity producers generally, not just the oil producers. They couldn't spend it all back with their customers. They didn't want to spend it all back because they knew, in many cases, that they were working from a declining resource. They wanted to save some to generate an income for the days in the future when the oil wouldn't be there or wouldn't be there in the same quantities. So what they did was they lent the money back, and they lent it to people like us and to the Americans. And this was the source of that borrowing I just showed you. We were borrowing the money back so that we could spend it again the next year. And so the indebtedness of the OECD countries built up and built up. And you can see how much was being borrowed by the so-called developed countries from developing economies, the countries from which they were buying their raw materials. And so world debt doubled in 10 years, but it was the OECD countries, the advanced economies in this chart that increased. The emerging economies didn't increase their debt in relation to their national income. Now, whenever in the US it's been found that more than 4% of the national income gets spent on oil, the economy tends to go into a recession. Now just think for a minute why this is. This is money that is leaving the country increasingly because the US is more and more dependent on foreign oil. So this is incomes that would otherwise have been spent within the US that just aren't available to provide growth and expansion within the US. And it's exactly the same in Ireland at present. As we try and grow out of our debt crisis at the moment, we're doing so against a background of rising food, fuel and other commodity prices. And this is taking all the goodness out of, let's say, the increase in export income that we're getting. So whenever oil price has risen, you see that the arrows there, the US economy has grown very much more slowly. And you have to ask, what is the current level of oil prices going to do? And oil prices, as you might expect, whenever they rise, they dent business profits because money leaves the countries concerned. So, at last, the International Energy Agency has admitted that we've passed peak oil. They've been denying this for months. But this is a statement from Fatih Birol, the chief economist of the IEA. And he's pointing out the problems that higher oil prices and general commodity prices are going to present in Europe, that economic recovery efforts can well be strangled. That's exactly the situation that Ireland finds itself in at the moment. So we ought to look, if we're thinking about putting money into circulation in any way, what are the energy prospects in future? Now this graph is prepared by a Canadian analyst called Paul Cheversky, and the grey area at the bottom is oil. The dotted area above that is gas. Above that, you've got coal. Then you've got nuclear, hydro, and a very thin skin right at the top of renewables. And you might think that is extraordinarily gloomy. That it shows that the total energy sort of output, including renewables, is going to fall very rapidly indeed. So it's worth looking at the individual figures very quickly that go into Cheversky's calculations. That's the drop-off in oil, and other people have produced a similar graph. There's gas. Now this is conventional gas, and there is a question mark about total gas supplies, because you'll all have heard of fracking, of the development of shale gas. The strata is broken up essentially by sending hydraulic shocks down wells. Exploration for this is going on in Clare, but the environmental consequences of this are absolutely dire. A lot of methane escapes. It's more damaging than coal, certainly with the present technologies, and water water supplies, underground water supplies, often get polluted. But that's another question. There is massive potential if we allow shale gas to be supported. So this is a wild card at the moment. But if you look at this, this shows how American gas supplies, which were on a plateau since shale gas began to be exploited, has begun to climb. That's coal. Everybody thought there was a lot of coal. Yes, there is a lot of coal, but it's progressively difficult. It takes more and more energy to get it out of the ground. You're dealing with thinner and thinner seams. So if you put those sources together, you get the sort of graph. You get the graph that I showed you, and you can see that the peaks. Look at the peaks of oil comes first, then we might have gas, then then coal, and then we might have gas. We don't know what the gas situation is. Renewables rise to a peak about 2070, but then there is so little energy available to the economy that their growth can't continue, and in fact they begin to fall off because you can't maintain those that you've got. The same applies to hydro, nuclear. You get an initial investment over the next few years, but then that begins to fall off too. So what are we saying? We're saying that there is going to be very much less energy available in future. But let's concentrate on oil. There's been a very close relationship between global oil production and world GDP. You can see. So what happens when oil begins to fall off? What does this mean for a money supply? And these are my 9 conclusions that I'd like you to take away with you. Our present money supply is in fact too great if it's to maintain its value. Far too much has been injected. So we either get an inflation as the price of energy and other commodities rises in real terms, and we know the central banks are worried about that, or money gets withdrawn from circulation. And in a debt-based system, that could well happen because people may not wish to borrow quite so much. They may do what they're doing in Ireland, repaying as much money to the banks as they possibly can. Other money gets sort of lost by bankruptcies, and essentially the money creation system that we've got at the moment breaks down, because if your incomes are falling, who is going to wish to borrow? New debt-based, new non-debt-based ways of injecting money into the economy has to be found. Having the state inject this non-debt money into the economy would, in my view, give too much power to the state. We need a much more broadly based way of getting money into circulation. And in my view, money should be created by or on behalf of its users. And this is one of the ways, this is the way that has been proposed by a proposal from FASTA in its liquidity network idea. Energy is the new money. This in fact means that the energy producers are going to become, or have the potential to become, the new banks. They will quite literally have the power, in the way that banks have done until recently, the power to decide who gets what's good as security, what projects go ahead. It therefore matters absolutely crucially who creates the energy and by whom. And I think that a lot of energy needs to be created by communities. Because if a community is depending on outside sources for its energy, but because of the shrinking supply, the real price of energy is rising and rising, then that means more and more and more of whatever that community is producing is having to go to buy its energy. So countries should aim for energy self-reliance, but equally communities within countries should be doing so too. So a local energy supply can be used as the basis of a local currency and of a local bank. And if people aren't going to be prepared to borrow, if it's absolutely foolish to borrow because you know that your income next year is going to be less than it is this year, then new ways of financing have to be found. And these are likely to be based on a share of the income. In other words, something like Chris Cook's equity partnerships, rather than a share of the profits. Asset values are going to fall because they've got to keep their relationship with incomes. We can only afford to spend a proportion of our income on buying a house, or a proportion of our income on buying, let's say, an investment to save as part of our pension. So as incomes fall, asset values are going to fall with them. And so my final point is, once investors actually twig this, once the real import of what oil peak means actually registers, people are going to realize that if you've got essentially assets which only have value because they are a claim on somebody else's income, let's say you've got a city centre shop, its value now is likely to be, because it's based on turnover now, is likely to be greater than it is later. You're going to want to get out of those assets as quickly as possible because they're going to fall. There's going to be, or could be, a rush to dump assets which represent claims on income and go into assets which represent actually something tangible, like land, something which will always be there, rather than these paper claims. So a dumping of assets will cause an enormous problems for the conventional banking system, because it has secured its loans against these, and so as assets values fall, as people rush to get out of them, the banking system will find that its security isn't there, and we're going to get a continuation of the damage done to the banking system that has been done by the collapse in the property assets that the Irish banks relied upon. So we face very real changes. And so if we're planning a money system, we can't just inject new money into it on some other basis, other than debt. We have to decide what basis is the new money going into circulation, Is it an exchange currency? Do we want it to keep its value? Do we want it to be a savings currency? And so this is a very important aspect of monetary design and monetary policy, which I can only touch on here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Nat and to Emer for all of the work that both of you put into organizing the event and for the invitation to come all the way out here to speak to you all today. We really do appreciate it. So where is there it is. So this is the title that Emer supplied me, and I think it's a nice title. It works well with what I want to talk to you about today. Solutions for the euro problem and specifically for the Irish problem. Obviously, this is not the way things were supposed to unfold, right? When the euro was introduced, there were a few euro skeptics out there, but at least in our profession, among economists, there weren't a lot of voices saying, hold on, wait a minute, you might want to stop and reconsider the way that you're introducing this new currency for a variety of reasons. There are likely to be problems down the road. Most people turn to the optimum currency area theory, which is an economic theory that was used to justify the introduction of the euro and the creation of the eurozone. The theory itself was developed by an economist by the name of Robert Mundell, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, and therefore he must be right, and we must be able to rely on the theories and ideas that underlie this theory. So what the optimum currency area theory says is, if a group of nations is considering giving up their individual sovereign currencies in favor of a common currency, it might make sense if, and initially Mundell had just one big if, and he said it would make sense if labor was mobile enough to move from region to region in the event that, for a set of countries, a downturn occurred here, but the rest were doing all right. Mundell said, as long as labor can move from the country where unemployment is rising to one or more countries where the unemployment rate is low, the system will stabilize itself, and it's all right that these countries have given up their currency and therefore the ability to conduct their own monetary policy. You can't change the interest rate anymore. That's up to the ECB. And you can't devalue to try to gain a competitive advantage with respect to trade. That's okay, Mundell said, because economies will tend to self-stabilize, labor will move, and it's all right to have just one monetary policy for everybody. Now, the fact that the euro was introduced suggests that there was sufficient buy-in, a belief that the eurozone was itself an optimum currency area, that the benefits of moving to a common currency would outweigh the costs of giving up the interest rate and the ability to change your exchange rate. And Mundell said, look, this is a large region, it's very open economy, it's the perfect environment for a common currency. He even said that over time, the Eurozone area would grow so much, other countries would join, Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, eventually the Middle East. He envisioned this being an enormous project with tremendous buy-in that would eventually overtake the dollar. The euro would become the reserve currency for the world, and he said this would bring the exorbitant privilege to the region. The ability to run a deficit without tears is what Mundell told us. A deficit without tears. What was the problem with Mundell's thinking? The problem is that the exorbitant privilege to run a deficit without tears only applies to countries that retain their sovereign currencies. Mundell was just simply wrong when he said, given the fait accompli of the EMU and the euro, there are high costs to Britain staying out. One, he said, is the loss of sovereignty. Macroeconomic policy will increasingly be in the hands of those countries that adopted the euro. The UK would be left out. Right? It would lose its sovereignty. That's exactly the opposite of what is true. By retaining its currency, by keeping the pound, Britain retained its sovereignty, its ability to act in the macroeconomic policy sphere. By giving up the pund, Ireland lost her sovereignty. Ireland is now the user of its currency. Governments like the UK, the US, Australia, and Canada are the issuers of their currency, and as a result, they are sovereign. These ideas underlie the approach that's adopted by several of us that Emer somehow discovered, and I think after a bit of wrestling with some of the ideas came to the conclusion that they were not entirely crazy, and so she invited us out to talk to you about these. And so these ideas are based on what has become known as MMT, modern money theory. It is not exactly modern in terms of the approach, and it is really not all that theoretical, but it's a name that we sort of were given, and we just use it now. So the idea is that when we're talking about a modern monetary system, there are things that governments can do when they have sovereign currencies that they control that governments without a sovereign currency cannot do. And some of the fundamental principles that are part of this approach are the idea that taxes drive money. In this way of thinking, you don't want to think about taxes as something that the government imposes in order to get money from the private sector. The government is the issuer of the currency. It's not out to get money. What does the government want? It wants resources. It wants real things. It wants bridges and armies and schools and hospitals. And the way that it moves those resources from the private sector to the public domain is through the tax system. So the private sector, you and I, we need the government's money. Right? We need the government's money because we have tax liabilities to the state. The government doesn't need its own money. It uses the tax to move the resources from the private sector into the public domain. Taxes don't function to raise revenue per se, but they do allow the government to regulate aggregate demand. Taxes are like a thermostat in your home. When the economy is running too cold, you lower taxes. Right? That increases disposable income. That increases spending. When the economy is running too hot and you're worried about inflation and bottlenecks in production, you raise taxes to cool the economy off. Right? Taxes allow the government to regulate economic activity. Bonds, similarly, now look, when the government spends, it spends money into existence. Governments spend by crediting bank accounts. New money is created every time the government makes a purchase. Taxes withdraw money. They destroy money. So on balance, if the government is spending more than it's collecting in taxes, it is running a deficit. Right? What happens to the extra money that the private sector is holding? That depends. They might save it as cash. But if they don't want to save it in its non-interest earning form, the government offers an alternative, and that is a government bond. Basically, you can take your money out of your checking account and put it in a savings account. In the US, we call it a Treasury Bond. Right? The government offers an interest earning alternative. Why does it do that? Well, there's a belief that it's nice if the private sector has a good, safe asset in its portfolio that provides some rate of return, an alternative to holding cash. But the bonds should not be thought of as a borrowing tool, something that the government must do in order to be able to afford to spend more than it collects in taxes. The bonds are what the government chooses to do, the bond sales, in order to give the private sector an interest-earning asset to swap for its otherwise interest-free currency. Modern money theory also adopts the idea that you should never look at the budget balance and say the budget should be no more than 3% of GDP, 2% of GDP. The budget should always be balanced. The budget should always be in surplus. You don't target the size of the budget, you target the economic activity. You target the unemployment rate, target the growth rate. You target something real and you allow the budget to adjust to allow you to achieve that goal. And finally, we recognize that unemployment is de facto evidence that the deficit is too small. When you have unemployment, it is an indication that you have people who want to work for the government's money, but they're unable to find a job. If you have unemployment, your deficit is too small. Okay, so our approach recognizes this fundamental relationship between the government's ability to control the currency, to be the issuer of the currency, and its ability to run a deficit without tears. Right? Its power in the policy sphere. When you give up the currency, you give up the power. With respect to the euro, this is something that a handful of economists, not a lot, recognized well before the euro was even launched, right? Just in the early discussion phase. British economist by the name of Charles Goodhart was one of the first that we came across, and certainly one of the most respected and well known. He was formerly at the Bank of England, and he was an economist at the LSE. And Goodhart warned that the euro was being introduced in a very dangerous way. And the problem that he saw was that you were taking monetary policy and handing it to the ECB so that you would have national monetary policy, well, one size fits all, and then you would leave fiscal policy behind at the state level, and there would be no ability to coordinate the two. We did this conference that was centered around Goodhart's article, and I published this book, and Randy, who's going to speak later today, contributed a chapter, and I wrote a chapter, and these are things that we were warning about more than a decade ago. So the Maastricht Treaty is full of flaws. Okay? These are just some that came to mind. It underestimated the possibility of a massive banking crisis, and therefore it did not have anything in the Maastricht Treaty to say what do you do if there's a massive banking crisis. It didn't even make the ECB responsible as a lender of last resort. That wasn't even mentioned. Okay? It overestimated the importance of price stability and of the central bank's ability to generate it. The ECB has a sole mandate. Wouldn't it be nice to just have your boss tell you have one job to do? The ECB's sole mandate is price stability. That's it. In the US, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. It's supposed to promote price stability, but also high levels of growth and high levels of employment. The ECB, one job, price stability. Okay. The Maastricht Treaty underestimated the power of the bond markets to discipline member governments. In fact, the thinking was, and this was certainly something that Mundell wrote a lot about, once you introduce the euro, and you have 11 initially, right, governments all borrowing in euro, that financial markets wouldn't even be able to tell the difference between a German bond that promises to pay euros in the future and a Spanish bond and an Italian bond. They all should look alike, right? They should have been identical instruments. And in fact, what most economists predicted and what Mundell predicted was that interest rates would converge to the benchmark German rate, because they would be indistinguishable. But of course, they're not indistinguishable. Financial markets recognize the risk of default is different for different countries, and they respond with higher interest rates for countries they're concerned about. The Maastricht Treaty overestimated the feasibility of its no bailout clause. The treaty itself says under no circumstances will the ECB step in and bail out a country if it gets itself into financial trouble. We will not buy your bonds. We will not assist you. You're on your own. Right? Well, It underestimated the extent to which budget deficits reflect what's happening in the real economy. The Maastricht Treaty says you may not run a deficit in excess of 3% of GDP in any given year. And over the course of the business cycle, you should have balanced budgets so that you run surpluses in the good years, small deficits in the bad years, and on balance, you have a balanced budget. Okay, as if the budget deficit itself is simply a matter of discretionary choice for every member government. You can choose a 2% deficit. You can choose to run a surplus, underestimating the extent to which conditions in the economy determine the deficit. When your economy goes off a cliff, your tax revenues go off a cliff. And all forms of social spending increase, and your deficits explode. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it, right? Finally, the Maastricht Treaty overestimated the market's ability to self-correct. And this is just fundamental mainstream economic thinking, the idea that economies are inherently stable. They may occasionally experience an outside shock of some kind, but the shock absorbers are there. It can self-correct. In Mundel's world, labor moves. You're seeing a lot of that, right? Really stabilizing. So because of all the flaws in the Maastricht Treaty, when the crisis hit, there was no lender of last resort. There was no blueprint for what the response should be in a situation like the one that you've been through. The Irish Central Bank sort of panicked and guaranteed the banks. Your deficits exploded as your economy tanked. Financial markets rightly began to worry because they recognized that as users of the currency, the Irish government may not be able to pay back its debts, because your ability to pay depends upon your ability to raise euros through either borrowing or taxing. Otherwise, you can't pay. Financial markets recognize the possibility of default, and they respond by saying we'll continue to lend, but only at higher and higher interest rates. You borrowed at higher and higher interest rates, your debt levels exploded. Rating agencies responded by saying, wait a minute, this is not looking good. We're increasingly pessimistic. We're worried that you're not going to be able to pay it back. And they downgraded Irish debt to one notch above junk. Right? Then financial markets stopped lending altogether, and you ended up with a bailout with the ECB and IMF. Strings attached, of course. Right? So you get the bailout, but on conditions typical of the old style IMF. Get your financial house in order. Big cuts, big austerity, right? So your government is promised to make $15 billion in savings, to show $15 billion in savings through a combination of cuts of about $10 billion, increased taxes of about $5 billion, everything from rising income taxes, the VAT, new site value taxes, minimum wages gone down, pension reform, variety of cuts to social welfare, and so on, okay? And this is supposed to be the solution to the Irish problem. The head of the IMF says, the issue now is to see how the measures will be implemented, especially those concerning the labor market. You can see who's going to pay the greatest price in all of this. And it's going to be working people in Ireland. So now you turn to your experts and you say, what is the advice? Is this going to work? Tell us what to do. And unsolicited advice from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, they say it's absolutely the right thing to do. In order to achieve stability, you got to get your fiscal house in order, and the long-run solutions are going to be painful, but you need to increase your competitiveness. And the way you do that is by reducing labor costs in the peripheral countries. Right? Here in Ireland, I recognize at least one name here, John Fitzgerald. I know I saw his father mentioned in the paper in a hospital here in Dublin. So this is some local advice from what I understand are fairly respected voices here, and they're saying exactly the same thing. I mean, there's just a chorus of unanimity here. This is the way out for Ireland. restore competitiveness, cut wages, outcompete your neighbors. Well, it might work if it was only your strategy, right? But if you're trying to gain a competitive advantage and your competitors are doing the same thing you're doing, it's anyone's guess how this thing's going to work out. And you've got the competition. Portugal is trying to do the same thing, right? Reducing debt to improve competitiveness. They're talking about enhancing export competitiveness. Greece, same thing. Freezing pensions, cutting wages, strengthening tax collection, balance the budget. They're also, of course, under an IMF austerity plan to increase competitiveness. Spain, Fitch tells Spain, listen, we're concerned, your labor market doesn't appear to be very flexible. Spain sees the writing on the wall. They know what that means, right? We're watching you and we're thinking about a downgrade here. Spain responds. The Socialist Party leader says, we've implemented an austerity program, we're working on labor reform, we're going to get this thing under control. Same policy response, okay? Pay cuts, everything. Italy, even though its deficit isn't nearly as large, its debt to GDP ratio is high, and it knows it's being watched. The Italian government is responding with similar kinds of policies, trying to address what they perceive as rigidities in their labor market, an outsized public sector, a lack of competitiveness, and so on. So is this the fix for the Euro bug? Will this work? I can boil economics down into 3 little statements. I think this is what people should understand. If you want to understand economics, it's not hard. Sales create jobs. Income creates sales. And spending creates income. These are all intertwined. When I spend, it becomes your income. When you have income, you spend. When you spend, businesses see the cash register till moving, and then, lo and behold, the economy picks up and hiring begins. So the key is who will do the spending, because it's all driven by spending. It can only come from one of 4 places. Okay, in economics, we say there are 4 sectors in the economy. Each sector spends. Who's going to drive the growth going forward? Who's going to drive job creation? Where will the spending come from? Households, consumption spending, not right now. Richard explained why. Housing prices are falling. Wages are being cut. Incomes are falling. Confidence levels are low. Job insecurity is high. Households are not ready to go on a spending spree. They're still deleveraging from the last downturn. Okay? Unless households begin spending, there's little reason to believe that businesses are going to go out and start investing. Government has adopted an austerity plan. Their goal is to get the deficit below 3% in the next 4 years. So that's not your engine of growth. So what does it leave you with? It leaves you with net exports. You're going to rely on the rest of the world to pull you out of this. And this is exactly what the Department of Finance, the Irish Department of Finance, has said. Okay? Your Department of Finance said households face numerous headwinds, quote, not the least of which is the continued need to repair balance sheets. It's not going to come from the household sector. And if it doesn't come from the household sector, it's not going to come from the business sector either. They say we're going to get the deficit down, we're committed to the program we signed on to. It's not going to come from government. So it leaves the export sector. And that's exactly where the Department of Finance has pinned its hopes. They say we are projecting export growth at 6.75% this year and 5.75% next year. And they recognize that their forecast assumes reasonably solid demand among our trading partners and further competitiveness gains. So look, 2 things. In order for you to grow your way out of the problem, you need to outcompete your neighbors, which by assumption you do, because he says we assume competitiveness gains, and you need robust growth, high demand by your trading partners. They have to be able to afford to buy more from you. But if they're all cutting their wages, and Germany's doing it too, they have an austerity plan, everybody's doing it. The US is doing it, right? The UK is doing it. So you're having depressed wages and depressed incomes, and you're relying on the rest of the world to spend more so that you can export your way back to prosperity. Obviously, it's a good strategy because everybody's trying it. President Obama has pledged to the American population that the U.S. will double its exports over the next 5 years. Tim Geithner and Hillary Clinton are in China every other week, begging the Chinese to please revalue the yuan. There was an article in the paper just this morning that Geithner is pressuring China to increase the interest rate, which is just code for please revalue your currency so you will buy more stuff from us, right? Please create some jobs for us. In the UK, the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister have both said the same thing. They are they're counting on an export-led recovery to generate growth. Germany so far is surviving on the strength of its export markets, but since it's become so dependent on China, lately Germany could find in the not too distant future, I'm afraid, that it too faces a serious economic problem. Ireland's Minister for Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, Richard Bruton, recently traveled to India to do what? To beg the Indian government to please create some jobs for Ireland. Okay. This is obviously not a workable strategy for everyone. It will work for some countries. Some countries will have export-led growth, but not everybody can do that, right? Because for every country that is exporting more than it's importing, there's some other country that's importing more than it's exporting. My trade surplus is your trade deficit. We can't all succeed at this, but maybe you will. Maybe your export sector will explode as you push your wages down and you outcompete Portugal, leave the rest of the Eurozone in the dust. But at what cost? How far are you willing to go? Austerity is not likely to be the cure that you're looking for. It's probably not the logical pathway to prosperity. Okay, the World Bank and the IMF don't seem to get this. They just had a meeting recently where finance ministers and central bankers from around the world got together and agreed on two things. One, we need to counter unemployment. We need jobs. Two, we need to reduce the deficit and bring down the debt. Not recognizing that unemployment is de facto evidence that the deficit is too small. This is a, how's my time?
Well, we've gone over time for the whole session.
Oh no! But it looks so interested. Well, then I'm not going to go into great detail because I think Randy's going to talk a little bit about this later. But this is a graph that shows the three sectors. If you divide the world into three sectors, you have a private sector, which includes households and firms, a government sector, and then a foreign sector. That's all there is. Their balances are related in such a way that this sector's surplus is the result of the combination of what's going on in these two sectors, right? So these two added together give you what's going on here, or these two added together give you what's going on here, or these two added together give you what's going on here. They sum to zero. And so this graph shows you for the US, the red is the federal government's deficit. Whenever it's below zero, there's a deficit. The blue is the private sector's surplus. And the green is, when it's above zero, a current account deficit. And when it's below zero, a current account surplus. So what it shows is that the private sector can be above zero, can have a surplus, only if the public sector's deficit is big enough to compensate for the current account deficit. It's the only way the private sector can be in surplus. It is exactly the wrong move. Fiscal austerity. This is something that Richard Koo, who is a Japanese economist and a scholar on the Japanese economy, said You never want to cut your budget deficit when the private sector is deleveraging, because we did this and then we entered a much worse downturn as a consequence. The bottom line, I'm coming to the end here, even if you hadn't had the housing bubble, even if you hadn't had the banking crisis, somewhere down the road, you would have experienced a sharp economic downturn. Why? Because you're a market economy, and every market economy on the planet goes like this. We cycle. We have booms and we have busts, and eventually, for one reason or another, you would have had a downturn. The problem is that you don't have a framework, you don't have mechanisms in place, and this is what Morgan Kelly was writing about in his piece just a couple of days ago. You don't have a framework that provides a lender of last resort facility, a big bank, and a government that's capable of offsetting those downturns with deficits when necessary. A big government. You don't have the capacity to do that. You have no safe funding mechanism to allow the government to sustain big deficits when necessary. Okay? The problem is with the euro itself. It's not a sovereign currency, and as a result, all of the countries that use the euro are like states in the US. They're like New York, Texas, California. They can't run persistent budget deficits. They are all users of the currency. The UK, the US, Canada, again, these are issuers of the currency. They are sovereign governments. They can't be forced into bankruptcy. In fact, they don't even need to sell bonds. The rating agencies and the bond vigilantes can be rendered powerless by issuers of a sovereign currency. So it seems to me, my conclusion, my thought I leave you with, is that the most obvious, most straightforward way to fix the euro bug is to say bye-bye to the euro and take back your sovereignty and your ability to manage your economy. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the sponsors. So we have a situation in which the worst possible response to a banking crisis was taken by the Irish government. And the leaders that took it still can't figure out that they took the worst possible action. Instead, these are bold, decisive, and innovative steps. The government used to brag that it was going to be the cheapest resolution of a banking crisis in world history. Very close to that. And in particular, they saved Ireland from having a high debt, you can read. But the aspect that really shows a failure to understand is it's as if you were being praised by a rival poker player for your brilliance, and you thought that was a good sign. Right? Yes, they have been commended, and yes, that is the greatest possible condemnation. Right? Let me give you an idea in combination. The CIA, of all places, and I will recall for you that the CIA is the place that waterboards people, or did waterboard people. In its official description of Ireland, in its World Book, it describes the budget cuts as draconian in Ireland. And the CIA knows draconian type of thing. Okay, now this is bad, right? This is completely discredited. You've had an election, yeah. So why is Ireland following the same plan to get out of this completely discredited government that did everything as badly as it is conceivable to do things badly? Why would there be, indeed, if anything, the new dominant party is, we got to be tougher on the Irish, right? We got to be more draconian than our predecessors. Now that's significantly insane. when you can't learn from disaster after disaster after disaster to stop listening to these people and their ideologies, because it's not economics. It is, we call them theoclassical economists, because it is a religion, and it's a religion that keeps them from learning, right? Because it is just plain dogma. So this is the IMF's version that you are signed on to by your successive prime ministers. And Stephanie has just explained why this is true. You have a policy that makes the recession worse. It makes it worse every day of the year. So why continue a policy from a discredited regime by discredited economists that you can see the results all around you are making things worse? You know, this famous thing about Einstein is that insanity is when you keep doing the same thing and believe that there's going to be a different outcome this time, right? Not terribly likely. And this comes from this view of neoclassical economics that used to hold Ireland and Iceland up as the greatest examples of why their policies, which were completely antisocial, were brilliant, right? It's, you know, you can read it. And this was very late in the day. This is 2007 and 2008 these people are writing. So you used to be a backwater, and you used to have significant debt as well. Soaring government debt. Again, Cato in 2007. And it was all brilliant, right? And everyone should follow the Irish lead, and the Irish lead was deregulate, annihilate taxes, et cetera, stop worrying about poorer people and such. And they said, look, Ireland, great. Everyone should follow Ireland. Well, you've seen, rolling forward, exactly what that produced. But they said the same thing about Iceland as well. The economic renaissance. Oh, yes. It was all of their policies, supply-side reforms, and that means the tax cuts, the deregulation, and, of course, predictable results. Unemployment is virtually non-existent. Well, what happened in both Ireland and Iceland? But for the collapse of Lehman Brothers, there would be no Ireland and there would be no Iceland. Iceland, the big three banks, were growing at 50% a year. They were 10 times the GDP of Iceland when the collapse finally came. At a 50% growth rate with compounding, you double in size roughly every 9 months. So if you had just gone 18 months farther out, say we had bailed out Lehman Brothers, kicked the can down the road, we would say, it would be 40 times GDP. The debt per Icelandic person would be in the 100,000 euro range. They all have EU passports, just like you do. The leading export of Iceland would be the standard joke about Ireland as well. It would be the Icelandic people, and it would be the Irish people as well. And they suffered 60% losses on those banks' liabilities. Right? So you take that size, 40 times GDP, and multiply it times 60%. Losses are running the same rate in Ireland, and for the same reason that these banking failures are driven by fraud. Fraud led from the very top, and it always produces this kind of catastrophic loss when it occurs. So now, of course, you have the Troika here, and this is what the Greeks call it. This is the ECB and the EU and the IMF. And when the Troika comes, it comes with all kinds of good advice. So the delegation, and this is only a few months ago, told Greece to sell their beaches to develop tourism. And this is one I like. They said also they should sell the land, including the former airport, and then that they must consider a fire sale of the land and talked about, well, maybe we should do things like sell the islands as well. Only the uninhabited ones, this iteration. But I particularly like the response of the Greeks to the idea of selling the Acropolis. I like the "at this time" part. Just come back in a few months. The Book of Kells would look very nice in Bond, don't you think? So, who could have ever thought that Ireland would come to something like this? Well, a poet of yours, 35 years ago or so, one of the founders of the Dubliners. His voice is so good I won't even try to emulate it. But that's precisely what these friends will produce. They will want you to sell enough of Ireland to make you strangers to it. The economy will be left in a situation where the Irish will largely leave, certainly their children, and that is not why anyone thought in Ireland. And certainly you understand the reference to the epitaph. Okay, but he also had this verse about fear of being betrayed to the highest bidder. And the answer there is Ireland should be so lucky. Because if you privatize, all those government officials you don't trust, guess who's going to determine the terms of the sales? And who are they going to sell it to, and at what price? Why would they sell it at a full market price when they could get so many more friends by selling it below a market price? Right? And this has been done in many countries. One of the famous ones is Telmex, which a telecommunications monopoly was sold to Carlos Slim. Well, meet the wealthiest person in the entire world as a result of that privatization decision. Roughly 7% of the entire GDP of Mexico, all to Carlos. So, we get Morgan on retainer. This is the second time I came in November as well, and he always comes out with one of these things a few days before, and it's really quite wonderful. Okay, he is right. Ireland cannot repay it. It is not a question of Ireland becoming bankrupt. Ireland is bankrupt under these liabilities. Right? Not a question of becoming, you are bankrupt. Your liabilities greatly exceed your assets. That's a definition of bankruptcy. And so while Morgan says we must at all costs avoid bankruptcy, under his own logic, Ireland is bankrupt. And you have to recognize that. And indeed, he really does. Because he says, okay, we're going to tell the EU, you want assets? We're not going to give you islands. We're not going to give you the equivalent of the Acropolis. Such a deal we have for you. We have some banks. And you can have the equity in them. Enjoy! And that's one of a number of possible ways to do it. So it's a good idea. You don't call it a default. Obviously, it is a default, what he has proposed. You just do it, right? And you say, fine. We call it mailing in the keys in the United States context and such. It's done all the time. And remember, let's back up. Had the Irish government done what you're supposed to do, which is you've got an insolvent bank, a massively insolvent bank, a series of massively insolvent banks, you put them through what we call a pass-through receivership. I'm a former financial regulator, right? And they open the next day, and they have deposits and such, but what doesn't flow through is subordinated debt. It is wiped out entirely, as it is supposed to be under every rule. That's the deal they made. Subordinated debt, if there's an insolvency, it's supposed to be wiped out entirely. That's why they got the extra yield. That's why it was allowed to count as Tier 2 capital under the Basel rules. And the creditors get passed through only pro rata. In other words, the deal was never that the Irish government guaranteed the debt of creditors, of bondholders. They get only whatever portion is available, just like in any other bankruptcy situation. That's the normal rule. That's the normal rule that the Irish government chose to insanely move away from and transformed a banking crisis into a budgetary crisis, which got promptly transformed into an EU-wide crisis. Why? Because who were the leading creditors? German banks. There's a reason, as much as the Germans, I was going to say a bad word, moan about these things, that they pay up, and that's because it is largely German creditors that would suffer the losses but for these bailouts, right? And wait a minute, they're German banks. Who was supposed to regulate them? Well, that'd be the German government and such, which failed completely in its task as well. Now, admittedly, the Irish government failed in its regulatory task, but hey, that makes you pretty much equal in all these things. No reason why the Irish people should suddenly be on the hook for a deal where, again, creditors got more money, a higher interest rate, because they were at risk. And instead, they're not at risk, and it's pure gravy train from their standpoint. All right? So we have a couple of family rules, but one of them is when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And Ireland pulls up a backhoe and every time it finds itself in a hole and says, how do we make it into a crater? Type of thing. So stop doing insane things. So if you delay, which is one of the great theories now, I mean, the central bank had said, well, you know, this is not a deal. This is a deal subject to renegotiation. And we're going to renegotiate it continuously, and we might get something a couple of years. And there you can see the leaks about, hey, we might well get the interest rate knocked down a percentage point. And, you know, again, that's like poker. And you could just see the Tushik come back and say, oh, what a great deal I got for you, which is absolutely trivial and will not change anything in terms of the overall bankruptcy or being locked into a recession, right? So the worst conceivable thing you can do is send more good money after bad, stretch this out. That is pure pain. You could see that the AU has consistently waited to the last minute, and that it's been vastly more expensive to deal with it when they deal with it at the last minute because it's a crisis. So stop it. Right? Merkel has said creditors should be taking haircuts. Angela Merkel, right? Good, do it, right? And she can start with her creditors. Morgan's, where we diverge, is Morgan's response makes the deficit battle, that flogging that I talked about, continuing every day. It makes it even worse. His answer would be to greatly deepen the recession. If you greatly deepen the recession, your ability to pay back debt is impaired, it's not improved. This is really bad economics at that level. But he sees it, I actually don't understand why even from his own economic perspective. If you take his own analysis, if you do what he suggests in the last paragraph, you make things worse. So we have alternatives that we're going to suggest in terms of the time. I think I should shut up and let you, and I hope get questions, if not food.